Good afternoon. We'll call this the hearing to order, and I appreciate everyone being here. On January 18, 2011, the President issued Executive Order number 13,563, mandating that agencies review the economic consequences of their existing rules. In this regard, President Obama follows a very well-trodden path that started with President Carter and has been followed by each succeeding president. President Obama, like his predecessors, when calling for review of regulations, noted the special importance of small businesses in the economy and the potential adverse consequences of imposing unnecessary and unduly burdensome rules on small businesses. At the same time he issued that executive order, the President also released a memorandum reminding agencies of the importance of assessing the impact of regulations on small businesses through compliance with the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Despite these reviews, the Code of Federal Regulations now extends to about 26 linear feet. Of course, this excludes the potentially hundreds of thousands of pages of guidance documents interpreting those 26 feet of regulations. This complexity imposes serious strains on small businesses. They have to divert limited management resources from running their business to understanding how they must comply with federal regulations. And once they figure out how to comply, they must expend scarce capital on the cost of compliance, be it modifications to facilities or new data systems to maintain those records. Since small businesses represent the bulk of entities subject to regulation and generate the most new jobs, I believe that it is very appropriate to focus the regulatory review on small businesses. I'll close with the admonition from Albert Einstein that it is easy to make things bigger and more complex, but it takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. I hope that the administrator can provide that touch of genius and courage to reduce the complexity of federal regulation and eliminate unnecessary burdens on small businesses so that they can create jobs and put Americans back to work. But with that, I'll recognize the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Small businesses are critical to the economy, creating nearly 70% of net new jobs and generating more than 50% of GDP. Their contributions are needed now more than ever, but rising regulatory costs threaten to undermine this important role. With the total cost of regulations equal to an estimated $1.75 trillion, this has become a real headwind that small businesses face day to day. Over time, this burden has grown, regardless of the political stripes of the White House. Recent research shows that between 2004 and 2008, the cost of regulation rose from $12,000 per U.S. household to $16,000. Many of these costs have come from major regulations, and there were 72 between 2001 and 2008, while there were 32 in 2008-2009. While benefits far exceeded costs each year for these major rules, this is no excuse to avoid reducing these costs further. With the weight of compliance continuing to rise, it will take substantial efforts from all those involved to ease this impact. One such way to minimize this burden is to ensure that regulations are reviewed after they have been enforced for several years. This makes sense because it is nearly impossible to understand how a particular rule will fully impact society at the time it becomes final. Such retrospective examinations are critical to reducing compliance costs while ensuring that a regulation's benefit is still realized. Over the last 30 years, the efforts have been far and wide to impose a workable and successful regulatory look-back process. Presidents from Carter through Bush have called for reviews of existing regulations. At the same time, Congress passed the Regulatory Flexibility Act in 1980, giving small businesses greater influence in the regulatory process. In Section 610, the RFA also included its own periodic review process. While these efforts have produced some positive results, regulatory costs have continued to grow annually. This year, an additional tool was put forth to deal with this issue. Executive Order 13563 required agencies to produce a plan to review existing regulation with a particular focus on promoting economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation. For many agencies, the level of public engagement in the development of these strategies was impressive, culminating in their release last month. Many of these plans were far-reaching and include novel approaches to reducing regulatory burden. However, it is important for everyone in the room to realize that many of these suggestions require investment from the government to implement technology-based systems or change complex reporting processes. That means reducing the compliance burden for the private sector entails higher costs for the public sector and the taxpayers who foot the bill. In addition, a plan is only as good as its execution. Given past failures and loopholes in the review of existing regulations, I think we are all interested in how it will be different this time. With no real consequences for agency inaction, many of these plans may end up being pipe dreams that do little but collect dust on the shelves. Irrespective of these concerns, reducing burden is a laudable, if elusive, goal. It is something that we all must work toward and constantly improve as the regulatory environment evolves. With this in mind, I look forward to hearing from OIRA Administrator, and I thank him for being here today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I now introduce the Honorable Cass Sunstein, who is the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget. He's the official responsible for oversight of the President's regulatory agenda and agency compliance with Executive Order 13563. Mr. Sunstein, your written statement will be entered into the record, and you may proceed, and you've got all the time you want, to be quite honest with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I just would like to make an inquiry.
Sure.
I thought that part of the agreement for him to be here today was that you will sing him happy birthday.
Is today his birthday?
Yes.
You want to lead that?
No. Maybe Mr. West.
Administrator, I tell you what, we'll wish you an official happy birthday and enter that into the record as well.
Thank you very much for that. I had almost forgotten myself that it was my birthday, and I'm grateful to be reminded that 29 years ago today, well, something happened, maybe not my birthday. It is birthday or no birthday, an honor to be here, and this is the perfect occasion for this. I've been looking forward to this discussion greatly because of the current economic situation and the opportunities that we have. In light of the executive order to which both of you referred, we've been able to make a lot of progress in a relatively short time to eliminate unjustified regulatory costs imposed on small businesses. In the future, we're hoping to do a great deal more, and we're expecting to be able to achieve that. Section 6 of the new executive order calls for the development of agency plans to reduce burdens in general, and one of our particular emphases has been on small business in the last months. Last May, agencies released over 24 preliminary plans, and this is the first time that a president has actually had the plans go out to the public, including to the business community, for their scrutiny and review. What the agencies did in releasing the plans was very publicly to ask small business, large business, individuals about existing burdens and to help identify ways to ratchet up the burden reduction effort. As noted by the ranking member, last month, over 24 agencies released their preliminary plans. They span over 805 pages. This could be a book, though we won't publish it in order to ensure compliance with the Paperwork Reduction Act. We are keeping them online. They include over 500 initiatives that will simplify the system and eliminate redundancy and inconsistency. What I'd like to emphasize is that as the plans demonstrate, a lot has already been achieved. These aren't just promissory notes. There are initiatives that have been finalized or publicly proposed from just a handful of agencies that are expected to save over $6 billion over the next 5 years. That's a down payment. It's not enough, but it's very far from trivial. A final rule from the Department of Health and Human Services reduces costs and improves access to care in rural areas by permitting hospitals to use telemedicine to obtain services from practitioners credentialed at distant hospitals. This is going to save money, including for small businesses that depend on or actually operate hospitals, and it's also going to help patients. The Department of Labor, in an initiative that was particularly welcomed by the business community, in fact, in my own communications with people in the business community, there was a degree of astonishment that this actually happened. The Department of Labor finalized, didn't propose, finalized a rule eliminating nearly 2 million annual burden hours imposed on employers. It's going to save hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 5 years. The EPA finalized, finally, the small business community had been urging this for a long time, finalized, finally, a rule excluding all milk and milk product containers from its oil spill rules. This is going to save $700 million over the next 5 years. The relevant reforms, as even a glance at the plan suggests, span a wide range. What we heard in our outreach to the small business community is that many are burdened by paperwork and reporting requirements that turn out in theory to be innocuous and helpful, but on the ground in practice, as the ranking member suggested, to be a hardship and sometimes incomprehensible. Many of our other initiatives are eliminating redundancy or regulatory burdens that just aren't justified anymore. The Department of Defense recently issued, this is finalizing, a new rule to accelerate payments on contracts to as many as 60,000 small businesses, improving their cash flow in an economically difficult time. To help small business borrowers who are struggling, many of them, the Small Business Administration is adopting a new electronic application to reduce the paperwork burden now imposed on certain lenders. That's going to help borrowers who seek small amounts of capital to grow and to succeed. I'd like to draw attention in particular to the plan of the Department of Transportation, which lists over 24 reforms specifically tailored to impositions on small business with an effort to relieve them of existing burdens. Every single one of the plans recognizes that this look-back enterprise isn't a one-shot endeavor. What I'm particularly excited about is that the plans encode the creation of teams or frameworks or working groups, ensuring that there's a listening process that is ongoing. If the plans don't have initiatives that should be included, then we're all ears. We want to see what would be a good way of reducing burdens now, and the agencies are available to hear the concerns. I'd like to be CC'd on any suggestions for additions. Many people have expressed concern with the flow of new rules, not just the existing stock of rules. And I can give you some details about things we've done in the recent past to get a good control on the stock. There was a reference, both the chairman and the ranking member made, to the President's January 18th memo on small business, which not only reflects the Regulatory Flexibility Act, in important ways it goes beyond it and imposes requirements that are supplemental, that are already helping to reduce the flow of new rules. What the President said in January of this year is we can make our economy stronger and more competitive while meeting our fundamental responsibilities to one another. We're going to continue to eliminate unjustified regulatory costs. This process has just started, and thus strengthen our economy in an economically challenging time. Thank you so much, and I'm much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Administrator. I'm going to open up with Representative West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also Madam Ranking Member and Honorable Cass Sunstein. Pleasure for you to be here today. One of my concerns is we've had many people come here, especially from the Office of Advocacy, and testify that their greatest concern is that they're getting backdoored by the federal government as far as implementing a lot of new regulations. One of the things that I'm concerned about is approximately 4,300 regulatory actions that are waiting in the pipeline right now. and 219 of those are considered economically significant, meaning they can have more than $100 million of impact on our private sector, especially our small businesses. The number one thing that when we go back and we talk to the people down on the ground is the regulatory environment, and especially when you talk to small banks, community banks, with Dodd-Frank and a lot of the means by which they've been caught in there. Can you really tell us and give us an understanding of what the federal government is doing to not allow the agencies to do, I call it behavior modification through regulation. What they couldn't get through the legislative process, it seems they're doing through the regulatory process. So can you kind of lay out the plan that you all have?
Great. The first point is that anything that is done by the executive branch has to comport with the law and within the boundaries that you set out. Article 1, that's legislative power in a Congress of the United States. That's the first substantive sentence in the Constitution. The executive...
But let me interrupt you. I'll give you a great example. Numeric nutrient criteria, which is something that the EPA sent down. I don't think anyone up here, there's no law that, complies with that. And that's something that the EPA has instituted. And as a matter of fact, in the state of Florida, there's a lawsuit that's being brought against the state when it comes to that. So,
okay. The big numeric criteria rule from EPA was numeric limits for stormwater. And that, I don't know if you saw, EPA actually withdrew it. In a way that produced a great deal of applause from the national home builders, saying this is a great thing for the economy, for people who want to buy homes and for people who build homes. It was completely withdrawn.
But not for farmers.
No, it was completely withdrawn for everybody. Wow. The stormwater rule was completely withdrawn.
Okay.
So I can give you a bunch of other examples of cases where we're all working together to address the problem that you mentioned. Winslow Sargent, who's the chief counsel at SBA, is a close partner. His February 2010 report emphasizes the big impact and the growing impact that SBA has been having on federal rulemaking. It applauds the trend line. And since then, or contemporaneous to then, a number of things have happened. You may have noticed just a few days ago, the Department of Labor withdrew its very controversial fiduciary rule. That was a rule that got a lot of concern from members of the House and also from the small business community. That's been withdrawn. They're going to repropose that. The Department of Labor also had a rule involving musculoskeletal disorders, or new reporting rule, where the Office of Advocacy and the small business community were both very troubled. They didn't know what it meant. What is a musculoskeletal disorder? And they thought that it would be burdensome. Are they going to have to hire doctors to test all of their employees who have back pain? That one was withdrawn, and the Department of Labor is working well with SBA. There was a noise interpretation from OSHA that the small business community was very concerned about just this year. OSHA withdrew that one also. So the number of rules that are being carefully reconsidered I've given you 4 examples just now. I could multiply that by 3 if you like, in response to the current economic situation and the very clear direction the President has given me and all of us to make sure that what we're doing on the regulatory side is consistent with the economic recovery. If there are other areas where we aren't being sufficiently responsive, gosh, I'd love to hear it, because this is the time.
Okay. The last question that follows along with that, right now it looks like we're on a track to have full-time regulatory employees expected to reach a level of 291,676. Is there a way that we can freeze the hiring of new regulatory employees?
Well, that's your lane, and mine is the implementation job. I work at the Office of Management and Budget, but the budget, the B side, is not something that I'm directly involved in. I can tell you, you referred to the 219 economically significant rules, so-called, in the pipeline. The number's a little confusing, because these are things that are under general contemplation by the agencies. They're not in the pipeline. They're not pending. They're not proposed. They're kind of like it's as if there's a law that one of you is thinking about, and you give a heads up to the 219 aren't going to see the light of day unless they can pass very careful scrutiny in terms of the new direction the President's given us this year.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator. We've been here before, and from Carter on, everyone has checked that list on regulation and impact on small businesses. What would you tell the committee this time is going to be different? And how would you get the different 26 federal agencies to deal with this issue in a way that produce the results that are expected, especially at this time when we are facing this economic downturn?
Okay. The first thing that we've done that no previous president did was to have public plans that actually have concrete details with schedules and timelines, in many cases, for taking action. So I actually had the privilege of working in the Reagan administration. I was 6 years old at the time, as you can tell from earlier. But in the Reagan administration, there was a very firm effort to discipline regulatory burdens, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. He did not have a sustained look-back effort of this sort. President Bush had an effort in the domain of manufacturing, but the agencies didn't come up with plans. So the fact that there are plans with timelines promotes accountability. What we're doing on our side is not just having, plans and aspirations, but trying actually to take action. So there are things that have been done by the Department of Transportation, taking hundreds of millions of costs away in a proposed rule just a while ago. The Department of Health and Human Services is going to try to free up hospitals and doctors from regulatory requirements that haven't been revisited. That's a $600 million annual savings that's well beyond the plan stage. That's actually a rule under review no secret here, that's a rule under review at OIRA today. The Environmental Protection Agency has finalized rules. This isn't just a wish list. And what we're trying to develop is fast-track procedures for the cost reduction initiatives that we see on the plans. So some of them have actually been proposed, some of these things, which means they're going to be finalized in the relatively near future. Others already have been finalized. And if you see things that you really like on the plans, maybe they're the export initiatives, some of which have been finalized or proposed. Please let us know if they really have an impact, and then we can see if we can do them quickly.
Would you have a mechanism in place to evaluate the work of the federal agencies?
Yeah, we do. We have a informal process at my office where we are very alert to the 500 reforms on the plans and looking carefully at what stage each of them is at. And so the ones that are proposed, like the Department of Transportation rule, which eliminates hundreds of millions of dollars in costs, we're looking to see how quickly that can go. There's an OSHA rule that's going to eliminate over $500 million in annual costs. That one's been proposed. We're looking to see if we can finalize that pretty quickly. And for everything on the 800 pages that looks really promising, we're engaged in an ongoing monitoring exercise. It's a little lonely, so if you'd like to join us and help monitor and expedite, that would be very welcome.
Thank you. Agencies reach out to the public in particularly innovative ways, and you mentioned some of those, like EPA held 20 public meetings as well as participating in the Department of Transportation's meeting where participants could attend those meetings over the Internet. The Department of Labor designed a website that permitted participants to post suggestions, respond to other posts, and agree or disagree with submissions. It seems that those agencies that had a low public participation rates could benefit from those ideas. Is OIRA considering sharing these outreach strategies across agencies?
Yes, what we encourage them all to do, we had some guidance documents during the initial phases of the look-back process where we encouraged everyone to engage the public because, as you said, often the people who are faced by rules and burdened by them have the best insights about how they're adversely affecting operations. So we have encouraged public outreach. We've attended to the fact that a number of agencies, and this also is new, for all their good work, prior presidents did nothing like this, have websites that are specifically dedicated to business outreach to see how we can simplify and streamline the regulatory process. Those are ongoing. And we have encouraged agencies to follow the model that that several agencies, including the Department of Transportation and EPA, have. What I'm very hopeful about is that there's a cultural change which has started within the agencies where each of them has either a formal or an incipient institution that's particularly dedicated to eliminating regulatory burdens. And they might be burdens that have been in place for 30 years. They might be burdens that have been in place for a couple months and that just are causing unintended or unexpected harm. And maybe that can be fixed quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Barton.
Thank you very much. In a former life as a small business person and now in nearly 20 years in the Congress, I have been watching the creation and the application of these rules and regulations. And I've noted a phenomenon which results in increased regulations, and I'm wondering if you have a solution to this problem. Initially, very rational, simple rules and regulations are enacted. And then when they are applied, some modest deviations from the intended response of the regulated is observed. And the usual response to that is more regulations. We don't want that to happen again, do we? And frequently these increased regulations pass over the line of the rational and the reasonable. And there appears to be no attempt to do a cost-benefit analysis. Is the benefit we might get from these increased regulations really going to be justified by the economic effects and just the harassment of the poor business trying to succeed in a tough economic environment? How can we get our people to do a rational cost-benefit analysis? The old farmer says, why would you do it if the juice ain't worth the squeezing? Right. For many of these increased regulations, the juice ain't worth the squeezing.
Okay, great. What President Reagan inaugurated in the early 80s was a cost-benefit analysis as a test for regulatory proposals and final rules. President Obama had a very clear embrace of cost-benefit analysis in his executive order this past January. And we are taking cost-benefit analysis extremely seriously. I don't believe you'll see a single rule issued in the last 8 months that fails cost-benefit analysis, and you'll see very few in the last 2.5 years. I think there's only one that clearly fails cost-benefit analysis, and that one was a congressional mandate on safety on trains, and we did the best we could to reduce costs. As noted, you can have a rule that survives cost-benefit analysis, but still the costs are too high. It could have higher net benefits if you scaled the costs back. But basically, the President has given us extremely clear guidance on following cost-benefit analysis, and we are responding to his direction. You may have noticed, this got a lot of attention, the President directed me to issue a return letter on the EPA's draft ozone rule. The bulk of that return letter was emphasizing some very specific points that bore on the rule in particular, but the next to last paragraph emphasized more generally, apart from the ozone rule, the President's directed me to take strong steps to diminish regulatory costs and to make sure that we're really justified going forward. And that commitment to cost-benefit analysis, you will see in every rule we've issued so far. You'll see it in the reconsideration of certain rules. The fiduciary rule, which was a very grave concern to a number of businesses, would expand the definition of fiduciary. It had some strong, well, I think what everyone agrees are some strong, well-motivated arguments in it, but it wasn't really ready yet. And the Department of Labor said, we're going to do a new analysis, analyze the costs and benefits, and see what the really the best proposal would be, and it's not identical to what they originally proposed. The examples I gave of rules that have been taken back are frequently taken back in order to get the analysis of costs and benefits as accurate as possible, and one of the most important parts of the new executive order says agencies aren't supposed to proceed unless there's a reasoned determination that the benefits justify the costs.
How could you have even in the back of your mind this notion that there ought to be a cost-benefit analysis and decide that spilled milk was an oil spill? Is that an anomaly that won't happen again?
Well, that wasn't I'm pleased to say that wasn't a government regulation. That was a statute, and it was an old statutory.
It was our fault we did that?
No one in this room had anything to do with it.
But we, the Congress, did that.
Yes, that's correct, and it was.
Please help us to keep from doing dumb things.
And
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
I don't think anyone intended to include milk. It was an artifact of the definition.
Well, there is some fat in milk, and that is an oil, but
you've got
a
it.
Stretch, isn't it?
Exactly. But you gave us a chance to fix it, and we did.
Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Velasquez. I want to thank you, Administrator Sunstein. Sunstein or Stein?
Sunstein.
Got it. We're from New York. Well, I'm from New York, so is the ranking member, so we just want to get that correct. Clearly, we recognize the need to streamline regulatory obligations, especially when and if they interfere with the viability of the small business community. And just sort of picking up on Mr. Bartlett's train of thought, I wanted to ask, could you briefly explain or distill, if you will, your cost benefit, the rubric, the general rubric used through your cost benefit analysis to determine what costs, whatever they may be, outweigh the benefits, or the benefits outweigh the burdens.
Okay. Usually, thank you for that. That's fundamental to what we're trying to do. Sometimes we'll have a rule that will impose costs, let's say, on companies that have to adopt certain management practices to ensure that people aren't going to get salmonella from their eggs. Okay? And it may be that we'll be able to have a cost estimate that industry will be informative on. And we might find that it's going to cost, let's suppose, $100 million a year, in which case it's economically significant. If it's going to cost $100 million a year, we need a full-born regulatory impact analysis, as it's called, which gets a full account of the costs and the benefits. Now, if it's going to involve salmonella, let's say, it's going to prevent a certain number of diseases. In a case of one rule we had, which incidentally exempted small business because they weren't the problem. That's going to prevent a certain number of deaths from salmonella, food poisoning, and it's going to cause a certain number of diseases averted. Economists have some tools for giving an economic value to the diseases averted and the mortalities avoided, and there's something a little a little mechanical maybe about turning diseases and lives into dollar amounts. But if you don't do that, then you might be spending $1 zillion for something that's actually a low-level risk. So these are tools that are used. In cases that are sometimes a bit easier, we'll have a rule like the milk rule, which will eliminate costs or save people money, and then you don't have to do any translation of a health problem into dollar equivalents. You'll just have dollars. And so for some of our deregulatory initiatives, some of our initiatives that involve saving consumers money from various various rules that reduce the costs they face, then it's dollars. And what we try to do is do our best techniques for turning all the benefits into dollar equivalents. The President has called for quantification in ways that have gone beyond even what President Reagan did. If we have something where the costs are higher than the benefits, let's say it's going to cost $100 million and the best account of the benefits is it's $50 million, that's a really serious problem. And we're going to try to work on that rule to get those $100 million costs down to $40 million. Then the benefits will justify the costs. But as the ranking member suggested, it may be that $40 million is too high and you can get the same, let's say, health benefit for $30 million or $10 million. And so a lot of our time is spent on seeing ways to achieve the same goal less expensively. And you've seen in the last 8 months a number of rules where the agencies have gone forward, but the final rule was far less burdensome than the proposed rule. And one reason is typically that the small business community will say, what are you doing here? So there was an EPA rule involving lead renovation for homes where kids can get sick if the lead levels are high. The small business community, including the Office of Advocacy, said you have it's called a dust wipe procedure, which is really expensive, and it's not worth it given the relatively marginal, as the EPA ultimately concluded, health benefits of that procedure. So EPA took it away. And the small business community said, now you have something that we can work with. And that's an example of where cost reduction as part of cost-benefit analysis can lead to a rule that's economically maybe more rational.
Mr. Hanna? Mr. Tipton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Appreciate you being here. Thank you. I was just out in Colorado. We held a small business subcommittee hearing, and the constant rejoinder that we heard through that was government regulation that was not a stepping stone to success and to be able to create jobs, but it was a stumbling block. In fact, you may have seen this. Report just came out, recent study, and it's showing that the regulatory burden on the American people costs approximately $1,750 billion annually. That's with full knowledge. We need some regulations. But the overreach of this, when we get this down to actual dollars, when we're talking about creating jobs, which is something that the President has indicated that he's in favor of, I'm certainly in favor of doing, is we're seeing $160,000 each year the businesses are having to pay for regulatory costs. When we distill that down to small businesses, according to this report, each employee, the business is having to pay $10,585 for regulatory costs per employee. This must stop. We are, and I truly respect your comment of trying to clean it up, and maybe we really need some legislation, because when you're talking about President Reagan, you're talking about President Obama, we're actually looking at executive orders as opposed to legislative direction that's coming out. But I do have a question. Reading through your testimony, I want to go back actually to the milk regulations that you'd brought up. I'm very curious because you state that, and this perplexes me, that the EPA estimates, you'd noted this was a law, and you just clarified with the regulation, but you further stated that this milk exemption will actually save our economy over $700 million over the next 5 years. How can we save what we never spent, what was never incorporated?
Okay, there's a lot of great points there, so can I say a little bit? In terms of the report, the $1.75 trillion report, the general concern that regulatory costs on small business and the economy are too high and that we should be doing a lot to reduce those costs, agree with completely. Mm-hmm. That $1.75 trillion figure is is in the nature of an urban legend, as a report by the Congressional Research Service recently laid out. It's based on an assumption of some analysis of a World Bank study that confuses regulatory quality and regulatory stringency. And if the study's right, then the U.S. GDP would be higher if we had a regulatory system like Sweden and Canada. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody thinks that's true. So the $1.75 trillion, probably to say it should be treated with a grain of salt is too weak. It should be treated as, not a reliable number. Having said that, the general thrust of your question I completely agree with. On the milk rule, what happened was there was a formal requirement in the law that the milk producers be subject to this oil spill rule. And we had heard, as the Bush administration had heard, from the agricultural community, this is a looming serious problem for us. Enforcement, as I understand it, of the requirements of the milk producers was weak for understandable reasons. It just didn't make much sense. But no one had taken care of the problem. And this was a very significant cost.
How does that still save $700 million that was never spent? That's the claim that you were making.
Because it was a regulatory requirement imposed on them that would have imposed burden.
Would have, but it wasn't. So how are we claiming $700 million in savings?
It would have, in the sense that the formal law required it. And if we hadn't done anything about it, under the formal law.
So it's really, when we're talking about an urban legend, the $700 million in savings is actually
that's an accurate number. And the agricultural community, which celebrated with great enthusiasm what the EPA did to take away that cost, didn't deny that the cost was taken away. They had worked for years to get the cost taken away. You're right in one sense. The cost, the requirement of the law wasn't being enforced. So what it was meaning on the ground is a reasonable question to ask. Nonetheless, the industry's own plea and ultimate very enthusiastic reaction is suggestive that there was a problem that needed to be solved. And I can say, while the Bush administration commendably started the effort that we completed, our final rule was actually significantly more deregulatory than the Bush proposal.
I'm running out of time, but I know you've got a complex job, but we're looking at 3,573 new final rules, and you're talking about the complexity of you, and it's your job keeping up with it. How in the world can small business keep up with this? Because we are creating uncertainty.
Oh, I completely agree that there's the problem. 3,507 new final rules, I'd wonder where that comes from. In the last 2.5 years, the rules that have been through my office aren't that numerous. In fact, we've finalized fewer rules in our first 2 years than the Bush administration did on average in its 8. Nonetheless, the concern that there should be great care and a reduction in regulatory complexity and uncertainty, that's something the President has directed us to do. And I'd love to get your ideas about how we can make the look-back process as effective and full as it can possibly be.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back time I don't have. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sunstein, thank you for testifying today. If you could just walk through with me the process that a small business goes through in communicating to your office an issue related to a regulation, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay, great. What we have available now, this is actually one of the first things we did, was to create on a website called reginfo.gov complete visibility into what rules are now before the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. So this, to my dismay, is not the most popular website on the Internet, reginfo.gov, but I wish it would be very popular for small businesses, because if there's any rule that's with us, they can see immediately. Now, that gives 2 opportunities for them to communicate with us. One is a letter to yours truly is going to be read very carefully. And if it refers to concerns that the small business community has about a rule under review, I can assure you it's going to be read very carefully in view of the fact that small businesses are the principal job creators in the country. In fact, in our data call, as it's described to the agencies, asking them to tell us what they're contemplating for the next year, we, this past summer, asked them specifically to call out and list separately whatever they're doing that would have an effect on small business. So we're available by letter with respect to anything. But we're doing better than that, actually, in availability, and I don't think this is widely known. I wish it would be. If any member of the small business community wants to talk to us about a rule under review, our doors are open. We have 100% availability. If people want to come and tell us that this rule is trouble, maybe it's been proposed and there are concerns about it. Maybe people don't want it to be proposed because they think the very proposal will create uncertainty. To the Congressman's point just a moment ago, we're available, and my staff is in these meetings. They're called, not so charmingly, 12866 meetings under the executive order that makes them possible. People can come in, and if there's a legitimate concern, as there not infrequently is, it's really going to be given attention. And that mechanism of face-to-face contact, I think it's insufficiently understood that it's there. The agency, by the way, that's in support of the rule will be there too. And not infrequently, the agency will say, oh, this is going to have this adverse effect. Maybe we can change the rule so that it achieves its goal without having that adverse effect.
Thanks. You indicated that your website may not be the most popular on the Internet. Do you have an approximation of the number of hits you get on a weekly or monthly basis?
It's a lot. I don't have it in my head, but we'd be happy to get that to you. I can tell you one thing we noticed was when we went to a somewhat technical presentation to this very clear graphical presentation where you just see colors and it says EPA and it'll have the number, HHS it'll have the number, Small Business Administration will have the number. You can click on it, see every rule that they have before my office. The number spiked. We saw a very significant spike in usage.
Is there an average lag time between the enactment of legislation and the enactment of a rule interpreting the legislation?
I'm sure there is. It would vary depending on whether there's a statutory deadline. So when there's legislation that says we have to do something by a certain date, that is taken really seriously. Every time we have a rule that comes before us that has a statutory deadline, that's one of the first questions we ask.
Understand.
Our average review time is about 51 days, roughly. That's part of the lag, but because rules typically are proposed and then finalized, there's a number of months. Of course, the urgency of the problem really matters. So if it's something where life is at stake, then the likelihood of a relatively prompt rule increases.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
I'm going to jump in here for a second because you're painting a picture that we're seeing less and less regulations actually being passed. But to get very parochial, right, for just a second, when it comes to the FAA, and some of this has security aspects, but you've got the large aircraft security proposal being put out there. You've got the BAR program being eliminated by the Department of Transportation. You've got security badges being in general aviation at airports that security is not an issue. You've got aircraft certification standards that are changing all the time. You've got airworthiness standards that are changing for aircraft or being proposed to be changed considerably, which will hamper operators in air shows in a big way. You've got letter of authorization changes for certification for pilots to be able to fly these aircraft. You've got fuel issue changes that are happening from the EPA, and that's coming down hard and fast, and there's lots and lots of regulations out there. And I see nothing but proliferation of regulations in when it comes to aircraft and flying, and it's concerning the aviation community in a huge way because it can cripple that industry in a huge way, and that is one area that the United States is blowing everybody else around the world out when it comes to exports and when it comes to production, when it comes to an entire industry. But I'd be real interested on your comments there.
Oh, I do agree that there are some sectors that are facing cumulative burdens that are not welcome, and there are other sectors that are facing overlapping, redundant, or inconsistent burdens, which can cause a real hardship. And in the area you're describing in particular, I don't know what the trend line is for the volume of rules over, let's say, the last 8 years, but I do know that there's an acute concern about what you exactly said, and we're working really hard to try to make sure that the problem of cumulative burdens, inconsistency, is addressed. If there are particular rules that you think have been issued in the recent or even distant past that aren't worth it, that's a terrific candidate for inclusion in DOT's look-back plan. And in fact, if you look at DOT's plan, you'll see the FAA has some very promising candidates. And if you see rules coming down the pike that ought not to be issued, in your view, or that ought to be issued in a way that meshes better with other rules, or ought to be harmonized, to use the word of the President's executive order, we'd love some help on that. I wouldn't want to say that the anything general about a diminution of rulemaking on the airline industry. Every single one has to pass a series of filters. All I wanted to say with respect to the volume of rules is that the number of final economically significant rules in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, this isn't widely known, but it's actually lower than the preceding 2 years and lower than the average under President Bush. That's not to say that we have the right level of rules, and one of our principal goals these days is to reduce regulatory costs. So the $6 billion over the next 5 years is a down payment, but we hope to be able to do a lot better than that in reducing regulatory costs. And on the airline industry in particular, that's something we're looking very carefully at.
Well, all of these aspects or these areas that I put out don't have anything to do with the airline industry. It's all about general aviation, and which is going to have a huge impact. And what we're finding from whether it's the Department of Transportation or it's the FAA, which is a division of the Department of Transportation, or even the EPA, we're not getting any interest in listening to our concerns. They are bowling forward and and not going to take those into account, and that's very frustrating for me. And it isn't just this administration; it's happened in other administrations, and not interested in listening, and that's very frustrating, particularly when you have an industry that could be impacted as greatly as general aviation. And again, that's every bit of this has to do with GA. And when I say GA, I'm talking about business aviation all the way down to your weekend flyer, and every business that's associated with that around the airport, and those companies that are in those business parks and everything else. It's going to have huge impacts.
Okay, I hear you, Mr. Chairman. If you would write me and or write the FAA and CC me, I promise you're going to get our attention. That the EPA withdrew its stormwater rule. It decided it had to reconsider it. The Labor Department withdrew its fiduciary rule. We have a bunch of things that have been rethought in the recent past, and if there's something that's not thought through very well, we'll get a handle on it.
Soraya Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Sunstein. I appreciate your time. I have a couple things I want to get to, so we'll have to be a little brief. Okay. Generally, what role does congressional review play in your decision-making process? For instance, Congressman Schrader and I, a congressman from Oregon, introduced a bill that exempts certain forest activities from being regulated essentially like an industrial site. You have a private forest. We don't believe you should have to get the same permits that an industrial or site would have to get to operate, right? In the Pacific Northwest, we have lots of water. rules, so for 35 years, that's how EPA has looked at this. They are now moving to regulate it, and rules like those cost jobs, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where we have hundreds of thousands of dollars in jobs on the line when it comes to our forests economy. Will legislation like this and the tremendous amount of support it's received from labor, from business, be taken into consideration in your review process?
The law is authoritative. So if that law is enacted, that's it. That trumps everything. So the legal constraints on regulatory action, that's a trump card.
So would your office be willing to help promote this or at least be favorable as we work it through the process?
Okay. When our lane, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, has a narrow lane, which is implementation, we don't get involved in what legislation is the administration supports, or if we do, we play a very modest role in that. So there are others at OMB who would have the lead on that.
Okay. Okay. Well, we would like the chance to submit for your consideration, and possibly if you need to move it up or down or laterally, we'd love to have your help in that.
I can get you in touch with the right people.
Okay. Yeah. With that, and I do applaud the President's decision to, again, he said it in the State of the Union, he made the case about a week ago, 2 weeks ago now, that he wants to review, and I think it's incredibly important. One of the things I'd like to have you consider, it's not just not implementing a rule. In many cases, it's the indefinite delay that is causing a problem. I think of certain things. I think of Boiler Mac. I think of others. Yes, we're glad that the job killing rule didn't go into place. That's good. But then sitting on it for 3 years or what have you causes business to continue to constrict. I mean, the uncertainty is just as deadly as the rule itself would be. And you said, you were talking about general contemplation. When you kind of put out there that you're thinking of something, it has that same paralytic effect. We don't actually float that we're going to release bills that we really don't have the intention, or at least the more cautious legislators don't do that, because we know it will have an impact just floating the idea. And so I would ask, as you're considering these things, don't float something that just because it's not in the pipeline doesn't mean it's not going to add to the uncertainty that our small business owners are feeling.
You're clearly right that there's a trade-off between transparency, this is under consideration, and adverse effect.
Now, if you're going to be taking action, it's different than general contemplation. Like, there's an issue we'd like to consider versus, hey, maybe we'll add another, person on, like you don't have enough to do.
I appreciate the concern, and we're going to see what we can do on this.
With that, a couple more things. I know the executive order requires agencies to review regulations. What is their time frame or required reporting process? Do they report back to you at a certain time? Is this a general ongoing thing, or?
Okay, great. So what the executive order required was within 120 days, they had to submit to the public, really, preliminary plans. And as noted, before they did that, actually, with our encouragement, they had public meetings, websites, engagement on what should be on the preliminary plans. That happened in May. Then they had another 80 days to finalize the plans. And so in late August 22nd, I think it was, they issued final plans to the public. Every single one of the plans says that this is an ongoing process and that the plans can be supplemented if there are new ideas. What we're focused on now is on taking those of the 500 reforms that are particularly promising and well enough along that we can expedite them and get them out and deliver some relief. We calculate up to $10 billion in monetizable savings over the next 5 years from a small subset of the reforms where monetization is possible. We'd like to see progress on those, finalization of those in the near future.
Great. And one final parting thought, as you're doing that, we want to help. You offered several times. If you want help, go ahead and kick those things to Congress for an up or down vote, and we'll let you know whether we think moving forward you're on track.
Thank you for that.
You asked, so we're offering. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Elmers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Sunstein, for being here today. I'd like to follow up on one of the comments. You had mentioned that if any small business owners would like to sit down with you, that your door is open to them. Right now in our economy, with our unemployment rate where it is and it's sustained, one of the things that I've heard consistently in talking with my constituents, and I know this goes across the country, in North Carolina and throughout, regulations are killing us is the number one issue. Does that call to action? Do you hear that? Are you aware of that? And is that promoting you to move forward on more things?
Yes, I hear that every day, not just on my birthday, that regulations are causing problems. That's, I think killing us is the strongest phrasing, but I've heard that a lot also. I'd say if I hear that only once a day, it's an unusual day. And because of the historic role of the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, created in its current form by President Reagan, that's something that we're intensely focused on. So there are two ways that we focus on that. One is this unprecedentedly ambitious look-back process where we are trying to go forward with 500 reforms that will be helpful in eliminating regulatory burdens. And the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, elimination of nearly 2 million burden hours. When I've talked to the business community that says regulation killing us, the reaction I've gotten to that one is, you're kidding, you actually did that? You took away reporting and paperwork burdens? That was greeted enthusiastically. So a lot of what we're trying to do is take away unjustified burdens. Mm-hmm. The other thing we're trying to do is to make sure that regulations going forward, which in some cases are the bulk of the concern, if they're going to go forward, they better have commensurate benefits. They better be saving lives or doing something great. And even if they are, maybe they can accomplish the same goal more cheaply. And in some cases, maybe they ought not to go forward at all. So the fact that you've seen many of the rules, not all to be sure, but many of the rules that have been of particular concern to the small business community being withdrawn for further engagement with the small business community. The most prominent of these was the Labor Department's musculoskeletal disorder reporting rule, where the Office of Advocacy of the SBA and the small business community in general found it confusing. And what happened to that is it was withdrawn. There was an EEOC rule implementing statute you enacted, the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments, which when proposed encountered a great deal of concern from the business community, saying this is confusing, regulatory uncertainty, and overreach. As it was finalized after a great deal of engagement under the with reference to the President's executive order on regulation, the Chamber of Commerce said, you heard us. It's good. This is very reasonable. We applaud this final rule. And that's a model where the disability community thought this was a good implementation and the business community thought it's okay, it's fine. That's a model that would be nice to follow.
I have one more specific question. One of the issues that's been brought to my attention are on private right of actions. In the regulatory agencies being forced to overregulate for fear of lawsuits. If this were something that were removed, do you see that this would decrease the amount of regulation moving forward?
I think the answer to that is clearly yes. Sometimes Congress likes private rights of action as a supplement to federal regulatory action. Sometimes Congress hates private rights of action as a recipe for overregulation, and sometimes Congress is neutral. So fundamentally, it's in your hands.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Ms. Velasquez.
No, I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple other questions. As I was listening to your comments in terms of inviting us, and it goes back to Congressman Butler's statement as well, in terms of the look back that's going on, does it really, when we're hearing about all of the challenges that small businesses in particular are facing, very, very shallow pools of money to be able to pay in, and they're paying it out for regulations, does it really make sense to you that the only real look back going on right now is the same agency that created the rules?
Well, I take your point. The way the process works is a little better than that, I think, that the agency that's doing the look back per OIRA guidance actually is strongly encouraged to make sure that the rulemaking officials aren't the ones looking at the rules for your reason. That within the agency there's a kind of separation between the rule makers and the rule evaluators. That's the first point. The second point is that the look-back process has been greatly informed not by the agency's own soul-searching, but by engagement with the public that's subject to the rules. So there's a process you may know about called Startup America, and I've actually traveled myself to ask members of the small business community what's causing problems. And a lot of the ideas on the rules, and in a number of cases this is specifically called out, they don't come from the agencies themselves. They come from members of the public who've said, this is causing a problem for us. The milk one to which you referred, the source of the concern was the agricultural industry. We have a rule eliminating redundant air pollution control requirements imposed on local gas stations, and the gas stations have said this is a very good thing. So it's not just the agency's own internal mechanism, it's also a process within the executive branch. In some cases, members of Congress have said this is something you should look back at. This is a cause for concern. The fiduciary rule, which has been revisited, it isn't look back in the same sense of eliminating rule on the books, but it is a look back in the sense of reassessing a proposal. And that was, many members of Congress said that the Department of Labor were worried about costs and benefits and unintended adverse consequences.
Well, I certainly want to echo the thought, if you want to try something experimentally before you go active with rules, right, bring them back to the committee, and we'd take a look. Well, one other point that I would, we did hold a subcommittee hearing that I'd had the privilege of being able to chair, and it was in regards to the GIPSA rule. There have been 3 recent studies that have been conducted showing that the costs on the GIPSA rule will well exceed $100 million, which crosses the threshold to have this examined by the agency. Are you looking back at the GIPSA rule now?
Not the slightest doubt. And the Department of Agriculture is very much engaged in assessing costs and benefits.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'll be on.
Mr. Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm generally curious. It's been widely stated here that rules and regulations are killing us. How do you personally feel about that? Do you think that's a fair estimate, a fair interpretation? Well, and coupling with that, how much of what is done in your office is subjective? And what type of people do this?
Those are great questions. Thank you. I generally don't talk in the terms of regulations killing us. That just wouldn't be my preferred phrasing, but that it's extremely important in an economically hard time to reduce unjustified regulatory costs and to make sure benefits justify costs. Absolutely. So the fact that we're able to save billions of dollars in regulatory costs, that's a very good thing. In the SBA's report in February 2010, what they said was their own interventions have contributed to the elimination of $14 billion in regulatory costs. That's a very good thing. So the fact that certain rules are being reconsidered to engage with the cost issue is really important. The President said just a few nights ago that regulations should be issued only if they are necessary, and that's phrasing that is orienting all of our efforts. So the idea of getting hold of the regulatory process to make sure the benefits justify the cost, to scale back on justified requirements, that is a very high priority. To get a hold of the problem of regulatory uncertainty for small business in particular, that's something the President has directed all of us to pay very careful attention to. In terms of the people at the office, there's an extraordinary staff at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. They are not political. They are many of them have been there for a number of years, going back across administrations. They are typically first-rate technical analysts whose basic job is to think, what are the impacts of this rule going to be? How much does it cost? What are the benefits? Are the costs real? Are the benefits real? How can we do it in a way that is as cost-effective as possible? And they've been doing this work in some cases for a couple of years, in some cases for a lot longer than that, and they are highly professional.
Which way would you describe the subjective momentum of what they do in terms of regulation? Would you suggest that would you say that it's generally more or less, or?
Well, I think the goal is to be as objective as possible. And with respect to a regulation where the anticipated cost is between, let's say, $100 million and $500 million, we want to get as close as we can to the objective account. And it wouldn't be shocking for a random regulation if those who are excited about it, let's say, in a community outside government, think the costs are going to be lower than we expect, and if those who are nervous about it think the costs are going to be bigger. And we work really closely with the Council of Economic Advisors, which is an indispensable partner in getting the economic analysis right. So I would say that really our goal is to get the numbers right. The subjectivity is hard to eliminate from human life, but objectivity is our goal.
And do you think that at the end of the day it's a pretty balanced approach, and that would be your opinion?
Well, I am honored to serve with a staff of professionals at this office who've been under multiple administrations, and I think they're really good.
You said it took a couple of years to withdraw the milk rule?
Well, this rule, there was the EPA proposed it. I believe it was in the last couple of weeks of the Bush administration. There were a series of public comments. Agencies have a lot of activity, some deregulatory, some regulatory. We worked very hard to make the deregulation as expansive as possible. And it took a while. Sometimes the fact that rulemaking takes a while is not ideal, either because it would deliver excellent public protections or because it would produce big savings. But sometimes the machinery works pretty quickly.
Thank you. I yield back.
A couple of last questions. Do you think that the agencies are going to have problems with the current budgetary issues that we have when it comes to doing their retrospective?
On the retrospective review, I'm very optimistic that even in the current budgetary environment, we're going to be able to see a lot of progress in a short time.
And my next question deals with the guidance documents, which can be just as big a problem as the proposed rule itself. Is anything being done about that?
Yes, I agree completely with the concern, as some of the courts of appeals have said, that a guidance document is actually a rule. And a few things have been done. The former head of OMB, Peter Orszag, in a very short but really important document, said that significant guidance documents, just like rules, should come into the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for review. And we've worked very hard to make sure that guidance documents, when they go out, aren't rules in sheep's clothing, and to make sure that they are really styled as and going to operate as non-binding. And in cases where that can't be done, the best course is to make it a real rule.
Okay, and last question, what about the outside independent agencies like the SEC? Is there anything you can do there?
Yes. The President issued actually a historic executive order. I think it's 13579, which says that the independent agencies should follow the cost-saving, burden-reducing requirements of his January executive order and should engage within 120 days of the retrospective review. So that no president had done before. It's an executive order. We've already seen some activity from the Federal Communications Commission in particular, which has announced, I believe, 83 burden-reducing initiatives. They finally got rid, by the way, of the Fairness Doctrine formally under the impetus of, or in parallel certainly with the President's actions. And with your help, there's limited presidential authority over the independent agencies. We think that there's real opportunity for cost-saving initiatives from the independents.
I want to thank you for coming in. I appreciate it, and I'd ask that you maintain contact with the committee to update us on the progress of the retrospective reviews. And with that, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to review and extend their remarks. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent that to submit for the record a report on 2 surveys conducted by NFIB and the Chamber of Commerce that shows that regulation is not the #1 issue impacting or facing small businesses, but consumer spending, economic uncertainty, and taxes. And since some members have continued to state that this is the #1 issue, I just would like to ask unanimous consent to enter that into the
Without
record.
objection, so ordered on both consents. With that, hearing's adjourned. Thank you very much.